Hello there, I'm Stella O'Malley and I'm a psychotherapist based in Offaly, and I've been delighted to do this talk online, digital, because we've been locked down and we're not allowed to do anything unless it's digital. So I'm getting the chance from Galway Public Libraries to give this talk in a way that perhaps some people will benefit. And the name of the talk is Fragile, Why We're Feeling More Stressed, Anxious and Overwhelmed Than Ever Before. And I wrote a book about that. And that reminds me that the libraries, and they are a brilliant resource, they really are. It's only since I've started giving talks that I've reacquainted myself with the brilliance of libraries. But they have these two great things that are very helpful for families and anybody who's feeling anxious these days, which is a borrow box, which you can access and listen to audiobooks. If you're feeling stressed and you are just feeling absolutely overwhelmed, I would say throw on an audiobook, put on your headphones and do something that's just like a jigsaw, or clear out a wardrobe, do something and drift off into the audiobook. It's very, very good. Distraction works for anxiety. People often dismiss it, but it really works. And Orbi Digital is another resource that the libraries are offering, which is kind of access to health magazines and different information about anxiety that people might find very helpful in these days. Now, when we talk about anxiety, generally what we're talking about is an overestimation of the danger and an underestimation of our ability to cope. And time and again, I find with clients that I work with in my private clinic, that is most people's experience of anxiety, that they're underestimating their own ability to cope and they're overestimating whatever danger is coming their way. So if you could deal with facts, that is a great kind of settler for anxiety, rather than going for the what ifs and what will happen if this happens and what will happen if that happens. If you teach your mind to seek accuracy, you'll find that it's much more helpful than any other sort of allowing your emotions to take over, which I find can be very, very, very almost alluring for the anxious person, because they want their body to kind of go with it and think, oh my God, imagine if this happens. And they ride that wave of the anxiety, and that can be incredibly distressing. And yet, almost like a horror film, incredibly alluring. And you want to go there, almost to freak yourself out. Now, there is a reason for that. The brain is a problem-solving organ, and the brain wants to figure out, what would you do if you lost your job, lost your house, and lost everything that you could lose? What would you do? And the brain seeks out problems. And that is what has made us create all the great art and literature, the houses, the architecture, all the amazing things in this world that have been created by the human brain could be stemming from that problem solving, seeking to problem solve. And yet it also leads us to anxiety. And that's what you have to be very careful of. If you're prone to anxiety, be very careful of how your brain could run that wave, go to that horror film, because A, because it's compelling and fascinating, and B, because you want to solve problems. And if that is what's driving your brain, I would argue, find better problems to solve. Find realistic problems to solve, such as, what are you going to do with today? What is your problem today? Is your partner driving you mad today? Well, what are you going to do about it? Because that's a much more rational and solvable, believe it or not, problem than, what if I lose my job? What if I lose my house? And whatever else during the pandemic and the crisis. Because there's some really, really, really solvable problems to be answered today. And there are also unsolvable problems. And if you could divide your anxiety into solvable and unsolvable, you can't really do very much about, what if I lose my job? What if I lose my house? And honestly, it's quite unlikely that the worst of all scenarios will happen. It's probably more likely that some of your anxieties might come true, and you will probably cope better than you think you will. So the more you can focus on today and what you can solve today, and maybe if you really need to, you need to give some time to, okay, the big one, I'm afraid of losing my job. I am genuinely, rationally afraid of that. And maybe give some time to that and say, I'm going to worry about that, and I'm going to think about that, but I'm going to do it in a rational way, and I'm going to confront it. As opposed to having it in the back of my head constantly zipping around, I'm going to take out a pen and paper and I'm going to write about it. Or I'm going to give myself a half an hour at 6 o'clock to think about it on my walk. And on my walk, I'm going to think about that and think about, what will I do? Or even better, I'm going to ring my friend or my sister or somebody who is quite good at bouncing ideas off, and I'm going to go there with them. As opposed to letting it off in your background, that you confront it, you look at the monster under the rug, and you go there.
I'd really like any of the listeners who might be interested in thinking about their anxiety, think about what they need at the end of this crisis, because we're in the middle of the weirdest, strangest psychological experiment that you could probably ever give your body. And right now, we have to think, what do we want at the end of it? Do we need our health? Is that what's most important for you and for all your loved ones? Maybe you might be vulnerable with your health, or maybe it's your well-being. Maybe your well-being was already feeling fragile before the crisis. And so you need to come out of this crisis with your well-being intact, because it could easily topple. Maybe it's financial stability, maybe it's job stability, maybe it's friendly relationships within the family, because you're actually not going to cope with a lockdown with the same 3 or 4 people in the house at the same time, and you're genuinely worried that serious bridges are being burnt at this time. Maybe you just are worried about your children and you want children who are eager and ready to learn. I don't know what specifically you want to get out of this crisis. Some people could just say, I just want to get out alive. Some people will say, well, actually, I'd like to get out with some coping strategies, because my anxiety has just gone nuts. My anxiety, which was always there, has taken over, and I need to learn to deal with it. And, I don't want to say, oh, there's a silver lining in every crisis, because there isn't. Sometimes things are just awful, and you have to get through them. And I know some people listening just need to get through them, and you get through them whatever way you can. But for some people, they could learn something, or they could get something out of this, and they could look back and say, actually, that weird time, that pandemic, it was this big, huge pause button in my life, and they call it the Great Pause, and it is because the whole world, 2.6 billion people right now, are currently under some sort of lockdown. And under that Great Pause, I learned something. And I learned how to deal with my anxiety, and I learned actually how to discipline my anxiety, because I realized before the crisis, I allowed my emotions to run ragged. After the crisis, I learned, no, that way madness lies, and I'm not going to go there. Almost like our brain is filled with sheep, and we're a shepherd trying to get the sheep through the gate, which is to happiness, to calmness, to well-being, to a good place. And some of our sheep keep on going off, but what if this? And what happens if this happens? And our sheep go off, and we, like the shepherd or the sheepdog, we bring it back, bring the sheep, we're going into the gate because we want to watch this film, or we want to hang out with my mate on the phone, or whatever you want to do, go for a walk and smell the flowers. And I don't want my anxiety to take over. And I'm learning to discipline my brain when I get anxious. And that's a very, very hard thing to do. And for some people, it seems to be harder than others. Some of us are born, with a very academic brain. Some of us are born with a brain that's kind of tends toward anxiety. Some people are born with dyslexia. Some people are born, as far as I can see, with a gift of happiness. And they seem to find life easy. I'm not one of them, by the way. Definitely haven't been born with a gift of happiness. But it seems to me that we seem to be born in different levels. And, just like some people seem to have a very physically easy body, they're gorgeous looking and they're physically, they don't get sick often, and some people are sick all the time. It's not fair. But all we have are the cards we've been dealt with. And if you're prone to anxiety, one of your big challenges in life is learning to deal with anxiety. And can this, I'm just asking the question because I'm very aware some people know it can't. There's too much to do. They need to stay safe. And actually, they're just trying to get through each day. But for some of you, you might learn to handle your anxiety in a more productive and more helpful manner than maybe previous times. So I did want to say this. I want people, more than anything, rather than just think, oh, I shouldn't be so anxious, I wish I wasn't so overwhelmed all the time, that you learn to reject guilt during this pandemic. That you actually say, stop, no, I'm not going to do guilt. I'm not going to do, oh, I'm a terrible parent. I'm not going to say parenting fail. I'm not going to say, oh, I'm a useless employee, or I'm doing it in my useless way. I'm not going to do that harsh self-talk, because as they're saying at the moment, this great article from Katrina Golden in the Irish Times a couple of weeks ago, she said, this is not homeschooling, this is distance learning during a pandemic. This is a health crisis, it's not an academic crisis. None of us know what we're doing and what's wrong and what's right. Trying to be a competent parent and employee and all at the same time is not possible. So what I'd like people to do more than anything for their mental health is reject guilt. Reject guilt under this pandemic, because there's too many pulls in our time at the moment, and it's very, very important that you learn to discern what's important and what's not, so you don't end up running with the hounds and running with the hares as well. Hunting with the hares and running with the hounds. So instead of becoming guilty during the pandemic, it would be nice if there was something that you could learn, maybe better sleep. For me, for example, thankfully, I have learned to finally, I'm 45 now and I've been maybe 25 years trying to become a regular exerciser and haven't been. And now I am walking regularly. This is momentous for me. And it's directly as a result of the pandemic, because they're telling us we've got our state mandated exercise that we can go outside. And suddenly I'm walking every day. Is there anything you can do that you say, yeah, actually, if I could get through this, if I could learn to manage my anxiety, if I could learn to manage my sleep, better relationships in the family, if I could rediscover joy, improve my coping skills, improve my ability to cope with anxiety or cope with stress, if you could do any of those, what would you pick for yourself? That if you could do that at the end of the pandemic, you said, yeah, I've nailed my sleep. I finally figured out what I need to sleep or what I need to cope with stress. Then at least you could say, I learned something, and I actually learned something that I really needed to learn in my life. I'm not saying everybody has to do this. I am saying that for some people with anxiety, where your brain can go here, there and everywhere, to tunnel it into one thing. Just learn one thing and come out of it with that thing, and you could be the better of it. So if you think about what exactly is going on in your brain, it's fascinating. When you get anxious, your brain, at the back of our head, it's the kind of primitive brain. And in there, quite deep inside, is the threat response, where our amygdala is, and where basically, if we feel threatened, all the energy goes from all around the brain straight to the threat response. And we start reacting with fight or flight. And I'm sure you've heard of that before. But everything gets drained to one focus on the brain, which is to protect. And so you might start worrying about your job and everything within you. You might get clammy hands, you might start trembling, your digestive system might go. There's a lot of different, behaviors that might happen, all because your brain is literally drained from energy to one place in the brain. And it's probably the most intense place in your brain, and it's not the most intelligent place in your brain. More intelligent prefrontal cortex at the front of your brain, that's slow thinking, it's methodical, it's not sure of itself, it's like a chess player thinking, I wonder what will happen, maybe this or maybe that. While the other part of your brain, deep within you, the amygdala, is fast, furious, powerful, full of certainty, and actually incredibly stupid in a way, because it's very basic. It's the primitive part of your brain, and you're basically saying, ah! And you're reacting in that way. And while that's very good if you're getting attacked by a mugger, that's very good if you need to suddenly react very quickly because somebody's jumped in front of a car or something. It's full of certainty. It drags a child out from the front of a car or something like that. But it's not necessarily good for somebody who's just sitting in their bedroom thinking. And for somebody like that, they do not need that panic response. What they need is the more intelligent and logical and rational response, which is slower. And to do that, you have to get out of your threat response. And some people get out through distraction, some people get out through humor, some people get out through deep breathing or just breathing slowly. There's lots of different ways to get out of that threat response from your panic response. But I do say that it's very important that you learn these are panic feelings, panic thoughts. They feel full of power, they feel full of certainty, and they're not necessarily true. If you look at the human stress response, they used to call it fight or flight. That's our fight or flight brain that I've just been speaking about. But nowadays they've developed that further to the fight, flight, freeze or appease. And I'd be interested to know if anybody ever wants to contact me Or for you to think about yourself, how do you react when you feel panicked? Do you fight? Do you go out and cause a fight? That would be me, by the way. I go out and cause an argument to whoever's near me. So some people, they go straight for the jugular, straight into irritability and have a fight with somebody. And why are you stressing me out? And you're always stressing me out. They confront the threat. Not necessarily the best one, but that's my instinctive. Some people are flight. They run for the hills, avoid, pretend it's not happening. You know, jump onto Facebook, look at telly, do anything but avoid it. Freeze, they literally become paralysed. Whatever they're doing, they might be doing it over and over. Something could happen that stresses them out and they find that they're just literally watching the same thing. They've literally gone into freeze and they're doing it over and over and again. And somebody who's an appeaser will be somebody who tries to kind of befriend their problem. So they might pretend it's not that good, it's not that big a problem, and they'll talk around it, and they mightn't quite really address it, and they might play it down and minimize it, all in a bid to make themselves feel better. None of them are perfect. They all have pros and they all have cons, so don't look for the good one. There is no good one. You do one of them, and maybe you do all of them, you know, in different ways, but none of them are perfect. So, you know, the fighter becomes too fighty, the avoider, the flight person just avoids all their problems, the freezer ends up very much like the flight person, they don't deal with it, and the appeaser probably ends up selling themselves out. So it's not as if any of these responses are perfect. If you were confronted with a lion or a tiger or a mugger, yeah, one of those would probably work. We don't know which, depends on the context. If you're confronted with your own thoughts, you're in your panic brain, it's not the most developed part of your brain, and you'd probably be better off moving it on, distracting yourself, moving yourself beyond it, deep breathing. There's lots of different ways to do it, techniques of counting back from 107s. There's lots of different ways, or even just trying to go there and think, what is wrong with me? Why am I panicking? What's the rational explanation? What is the accurate facts around this situation? Not the worst case scenario, not the best case scenario, but the most accurate scenario. And can I deal with that? Anybody who knows anything about cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, they'll realize that how you think creates your feelings, and your feelings create your behavior, and your behavior will reinforce your thoughts. So it turns into a triangle that just goes around and around and around. And for some people, maybe they feel tense and nervous about maybe their how they're feeling during lockdown, and maybe that the health crisis is going to get worse and we'll never get out, and oh my God, everything's getting cancelled, I'm not going to get a holiday, I won't cope, and your brain is racing. You're in your primitive brain, you've kind of gone into a panic response, you're about to tip into a full force panic response. What do you do? How do you handle that? Because the more you think like that, the more your physical body will start reinforcing, and you'll start trembling. Maybe your hands will get clammy. Maybe you feel sweaty. You might feel very hot or itchy. Some people feel very itchy. You might feel very irritable. You might get stuck in the same thought. I don't know what your regular patterns are, but whatever your regular patterns are, might be digestion. There's so many different ways, you know, even people like some people, they need to go to the toilet and they have to pee more frequently, or they might get diarrhea when their thoughts go mad. There's a lot of different ways for how you might react. Somebody else might go out and start a fight in the family, or somebody else might go out and be really kind of offensively full on with everybody, very forceful, because they're feeling tense and they want to get out of their body and into something else, and into something else's body. And with that, you might create fights, you might create tension, you might spread your anxiety. And you know, people need to be aware that anxiety can be very contagious, just like the COVID. You can spread it more than anything by selling your anxiety to other people. So you could start worrying about, oh my God, this health crisis isn't getting any better. It's getting worse. Look at the facts and figures. You go seeking something to confirm your worries, and then you go and sell it to everybody else in the house, and suddenly everybody's worried, and you're all reinforcing it with each other, and you have to be very, very careful. You haven't reined in your anxiety, you've pushed it out, you've spread it out, and you've sought out people who will reinforce your thoughts. And there might be one person in your family unit, or wherever you are in your lockdown situation, who says no, who does not do anxiety and says, no, I don't think that will happen. And you could, yeah, stay away from them. You could go towards somebody who will reinforce it, somebody who else is more likely to not indulge, but to go with your anxious thoughts because they're anxious themselves. And it's almost like two people who like drinking, like two alcoholics meet and they say, will we go for a drink? The other says, oh, you'd have to. Sure, you'd have to. Let's go for a drink. Sure, you couldn't cope. Very much, two anxious people can be very similar. Isn't it awful? Oh my God, it's awful. And they convince each other that they're right and rational and that all the people who aren't anxious are not awake, that they're not figuring it out, and the anxious people are right. When the rational and accurate response should be that actually, in reality, this is a terrible, terrible situation, but there is some thoughts that some people could get out of this with safety, that there is an awful lot of people within this who are healthy enough and who think that they're behaving as per the guidelines, and statistically they could be moderately confident that they will be okay, they will escape with their life. There are other people who are in a very, very vulnerable situation, that they feel their health is compromised already and they could die, that something awful could happen and they could get very sick and they could die. And if that's where you are, your behaviour would need to reinforce your safety behaviour rather than your thoughts, which would just deplete your body. If you kept on letting anxious thoughts take over, you deplete your body and you wouldn't be in the best space to fight off any infections you might get. And so therefore, it's more strengthening and empowering to kind of think, what I need to do is look after myself and be gentle with myself and tender and not freak myself out by going kind of riding roughshod over my mind and my body with anxiety and with other anxious people who reinforce it. You need to be very careful with your emotions during a very difficult time like this. So you need to also spot triggers if you want to be able to manage your anxiety and feeling overwhelmed. For some people it's unstructured time. I'm guilty of that. If I don't have something to do with my day, I don't cope well. And equally, because I'm a difficult person at the best of times, I don't work very well if I'm too busy. So you could be like me, that you don't work well with unstructured time, but also you don't work well with too many demands or busy times. And so you need the Goldilocks, the just right version, which is very, very hard to hit. For some people, it's certain situations, social occasions, behaviour. For some people, like let's say a lot of people are talking about Zoom fatigue and they're sick of the Facebook Lives and not the Facebook Lives, they're fabulous, but whatever it is, the kind of chats with the FaceTiming with family and friends. Some people are finding them very, very debilitating. And if you are, take note, it's a trigger. It's not good for you when you're feeling fragile. Some people have sensory issues. A lot of people have clients that I'm seeing at the moment, they're talking about people's eating habits, smells, the sight of a messy house. Their taste buds are feeling very, very sensitive. And if that's you, maybe you need a hot bath, maybe you need to change your sheets and your bedding, maybe you need to really look after your sensory style so that you're feeling more equipped to handle any anxiety that might come your way. Also, people could be not only knowing your triggers, but also know your own signs. As I said earlier, feeling hot or itchy as many people. HALT, hungry, angry, lonely or tired. It's a very good acronym for people to remember that when you're feeling hungry, angry, lonely or tired, beware. Because you could tip into your weakness. And if your weakness is anxiety, that's what you'll tip into. If your weakness is drinking too much, that's what you'll go for. So feeling overwhelmed, that could be somebody, or physical symptoms such as digestive problems, clammy hands, sweatiness, raised voice, your voice might change, you could suddenly have murderous thoughts, or you suddenly might need some quietness. If you suddenly need quietness, get yourself quietness. Part of self-care is figuring out what you need and getting it without causing ructions in your life. And that's a real, real precious gift to have. Can you figure out what you need mentally and get it without causing too much distress in your life? And if you could get out of this crisis with the ability to do that, you'll really have equipped yourself for your life ahead. There's an interesting app. I know there's apps, everybody's talking about apps and different, podcasts that people can do, but this is a good one, I think. It's Daniel, it's Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert from Harvard University, and they have a kind of a survey, an ongoing survey called trackyourhappiness.org. And what they've realized is they've surveyed thousands and thousands of people, and I've done it myself. And what they do is they ask you questions every so often. So you set the time. So you might say, ask me 3 times a week or 3 times a day. And what they'll do is it'll come in a series of questions. What are you doing? How do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? Are you feeling happy? Are you alone? Are you working? Are you with people? And they will relay your answers back to you when they've gathered enough data to see patterns. And what was very interesting for me is I found that I'm at my happiest when I'm working alone. And that was news to me. I didn't know that. I thought I'd be at my happiest when I was with my friends. And so that was interesting. And so I started to work with that. And it could be very interesting for yourself to learn the data around your happiness. But they have found from this study that a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And you can see the picture there, an unfocused brain and a focused brain. And as they say in this study, and I'm quoting, a human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. The ability to think about what is not happening is a cognitive achievement that comes at an emotional cost. What they're saying there is, yeah, we have an amazing ability to think. We have an amazing ability to dream up things that aren't there, i.e. anxiety, i.e. a fabulous work of art, a piece of music. We have the ability to imagine. We have the ability to think of things. However, that wandering mind does not lead to happiness. It might lead to great achievement, but it doesn't lead to great happiness. And so with that, it's quite important that you start addressing, when does your mind wander, and is it wandering in a beneficial way? The habituation curve is something that shows that if you can start managing your anxiety, you will get anxious, but that the more you face it down, the more you talk to yourself when you're in the anxious place, which might be every evening when you look at the facts around the COVID or whatever it is, the more you actually address it. So yeah, I'm going to sit there and I'm not going to let my mind go mad. I'm actually going to try and discipline it, and I'm going to be kind to myself. I'm not going to give out to myself, but I'm going to, with positivity, address it, and I'm going to learn to become habituated to it. It does take time, and it takes actually a lot of facilitation. So you might need a book with this, or you might need a therapist to learn or to teach yourself how to become habituated with the things that make you anxious. It's not something that's done easily. It is a skill. It's, you know, a form of exposure therapy, and I do explain it in my book Fragile. It can be done alone, but you would need to be very careful. It can definitely be done with a therapist and done with some literature. As it says in the quote there, it's just a thought, and thoughts will pass. The more we can learn to tolerate our difficult, distressing emotions, the happier we will be. And I think I'll finish on this. John Milton said it, and it's such a wise thing. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. We can do enormously amazing things with our mind. We can just go to such great places, and we've all, well, hopefully everybody who's listening has experienced happiness and know what it's like to feel good. And many of us will have experienced really dark times, really sad times, really hard times. And it's incredible how distressing our mind can be and how dark it can go. And if you can be very careful with yourself so that you don't allow yourself to make the hell of heaven, or you don't allow yourself to go to the dark side too much so that you don't feel too traumatized, it could be the most important gift that you could give yourself. It's very hard to learn how to handle your anxiety, how to learn to cope with stress. This is a really, really hard thing to learn, especially if you've been born prone to it. But it's probably one of the most powerful things you could do for yourself. Carl Jung, the psychologist, often talked about being a hero and the heroic mind. And if you could tap into the heroic part of yourself so that you can learn your task, your hero's task, is to learn to cope with your anxiety and your stress, then you can realize that I have faced down the worst of me and I've learned to come through it. And it will be the most empowering, satisfying thing you could give to yourself. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much.